Every year, thousands of people report seeing strange and unexplainable objects in the sky. Aircraft are lost under mysterious circumstances, and pilots report seeing things you wouldn't believe. Sometimes these events are documented by the pilots themselves, and some of their stories can be truly unnerving. Whether it's an unexplainable encounter or an aircraft seemingly disappearing into thin air, there are plenty of creepy stories to talk about when it comes to flying. What makes some of these tales even more frightening are the solid credentials of the pilots that reported these incidents. In this list, we will tell you about 6 creepy events that happened while flying. Number 6. The Foo Fighters. During the bloodiest days of World War II, the Allied forces engaged the Axis powers in the sky all across the world. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, aircraft had become a staple tool of war amongst the most powerful militaries in the world. With so many pilots in the sky, it was only a matter of time before they started to observe the mysterious lights in the sky up close. During the war, there were so many UFO sightings by pilots, they came up with a name for them: Foo Fighters. The first reported sightings began occurring in November of 1944. Pilots that were flying over Western Europe during the night reported seeing round glowing lights that began following their planes at impossible speeds. While the Foo Fighters had some pilots concerned, the lights never seemed to show any malintent. In most cases, the lights would follow the aircraft for a short period of time before darting off in a random direction and vanishing. What were these mysterious lights? Aliens? Secret Nazi technology? Or something else entirely? Number 5. The 2004 USS Nimitz Encounter. In November of 2004, over the Pacific Ocean, the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group, which included a nuclear-powered carrier, were conducting a series of routine drills. During the drill, 2 F-18 Super Hornet fighter jets from the USS Nimitz were suddenly tasked with an unplanned real-world mission by their operations officer. The pilots were given specific coordinates and were oddly asked if their aircraft were carrying live weapons. At the time, they were not. Allegedly, by this point, the Nimitz had been tracking an unidentified object on radar for several days. According to a senior radar operator, their screens were showing over 100 unidentified flying objects, or AAVs as the military prefers to call them. Unsure of what the objects were, many on board assumed their equipment was malfunctioning, but everything seemed to be functioning properly. Eventually, the 2 fighters were sent to intercept the objects. At first, the pilots didn't see any objects in the sky, but they did notice what appeared to be a massive object churning the waters under the ocean. Soon after, the pilots saw the objects that were appearing on radar. About 50 feet above the water, the pilots described seeing a 40-foot-long, tic-tac flying object with no obviously visible means of propulsion. The pilots, which were highly trained with over 15 years of experience, couldn't believe or understand what they were seeing at the time. One pilot later said, "It was so unpredictable. High G, rapid velocity, rapid acceleration. So you're wondering, how can I possibly fight this?" Before long, the tic-tac shaped craft accelerated off into the distance. Observing the commotion back on the Nimitz, the operations officer scrambled more jets to intercept whatever it was they were pursuing. The 2 original pilots lost sight of the craft and never managed to capture any videographic evidence of the encounter, but luckily one of the newly dispatched jets managed to capture this unexplainable footage.
Dude, this is a fucking drone, bro. There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. Look at that thing, dude. That's not our LNS though, is it? It's not. That is an LNS, dude. Well, if there's like... Look at that thing. It's rotating.
Number 4. The Disappearance of Flight 19. On December 5th, 1945, shortly after the end of World War II, the United States Navy conducted a training flight that went missing over the Bermuda Triangle. The training flight was comprised of 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers and 14 airmen led by Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, a pilot who was well trained in flight with the Avenger aircraft. The flight started as a routine training mission, dubbed Navigation Problem Number 1. The flight would travel to Hens and Chicken Shoals in the Florida Keys for navigation training, in addition to a practice bombing run. Towards the end of the training flight, Lieutenant Taylor's navigation instruments were acting unusual.
Both my compasses are out and I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm over land, but it's broken. I'm sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down.
Taylor's statement was unusual due to the fact that the flight had just completed their bombing run at Hens and Chickens Shoals in the Bahamas, and somehow ended up in the Florida Keys. Taylor believed the planes had drifted off course, adding to the confusion of where they were actually located. Taylor was finally convinced to change course and head west, to which he eventually canceled the order and changed direction for the final time.
We didn't go far enough east. You may as well just turn around and go east again.
Eventually, the aircraft began to run low on fuel. Taylor had to prepare for the worst and rally his men for an emergency landing in the ocean.
We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together.
This would be the last transmission received from Flight 19. Shortly after, the United States Navy sent 2 PMB Mariner flying boats for a search and rescue mission. To further add to the mystery, 20 minutes after takeoff, one of the search planes disappeared from the Navy's radar. Commonly referred to as flying gas tanks, it is said that one of the search planes exploded during flight and was also never recovered. This incident would create many conspiracy theories over the years. To this day, it is still one of the most mysterious aircraft disappearances in history. Number 3. Ghost Plane Over Greece. On August 14, 2005, 2 F-16 fighter jets were dispatched to intercept a passenger Boeing 747 that was flying over Athens, Greece. The plane, named Olympia, owned and operated by Helios Airways, was on a flight from Cyprus, headed towards the Czech Republic. Sometime into the flight, air traffic controllers made multiple failed attempts to contact the captain of the flight. With growing concerns that something may be wrong on board, jets were dispatched. Upon approaching the aircraft, the fighter jet pilots found a bizarre and puzzling sight. In the cockpit, they could see one officer slumped and motionless at his controls, and the captain's seat was completely empty. Inside the passenger's cabin, they could see passengers slumped over and notice unused oxygen masks dangling. There was seemingly no one around to fly the plane. Around 30 minutes later, a flight attendant appeared in the cockpit and began attempting to pilot the aircraft. The attendant surprisingly held a UK commercial pilot's license, but was unfortunately not trained to fly a Boeing 747 filled with passengers. Once the fighter jet pilots noticed the attendant in the cockpit, the attendant briefly waved at the pilots before one of the engines flamed out due to fuel exhaustion, and the plane began to go down. Just before 12:04, the Helios Airways Boeing 747 crashed into hills near Grammatico, Greece, killing all 121 passengers and crew members on board. So what went wrong on the plane to cause this horrifying accident? Well, it turns out shortly after takeoff, the cabin altitude warning horn sounded as the pressure inside the cabin spiked dramatically. The warning should have prompted the crew to stop gaining altitude, but the warning was misidentified, and the crew continued with the flight as usual. After a few minutes, several warning alarms and lights began to appear all over the cabin, and the oxygen mask deployed throughout the aircraft. After a quick back and forth with Helios Operations Center, the pilot succumbed to hypoxia and passed out, along with most of the other passengers and crew members. The aircraft continued to climb and proceeded with its predetermined course using its autopilot system. The plane flew hundreds of miles with no one who knew how to fly a Boeing 747 available. This series of events would eventually lead to the puzzling incident and devastating crash that killed 121 people on board. This may not be a paranormal event like the other events in our list, but it's a terrifying scenario nonetheless. Number 2. Japan Airlines Flight 1628 Encounter. On November 17th of 1986, a Japan Airlines Boeing 747 cargo aircraft was flying from Paris to Tokyo with a large cargo of wine on board. Piloting the craft was Captain Kenju Terauchi, who happened to be an ex-military fighter pilot with over 10,000 hours of flight experience. Also in the cockpit were co-pilot Takanori Tamefuji and flight engineer Yoshio Tsukuba. While flying east over eastern Alaska, the crew members observed two unidentified objects flying near their aircraft. The object quickly ascended from underneath a Japan Airlines plane and began flying alongside it, as if it was escorting it. According to the crew members, each craft had two rectangle-shaped arrays of what looked like glowing nozzles or thrusters, but was said to be very difficult to see clearly in the darkness. The captain claimed that at one point the object came close enough to the Boeing that he could feel the heat radiating from the object onto his face. Eventually the two aircraft departed, but what happened next was even more strange. One disc-shaped object that was much larger than the previous two began approaching the Boeing and followed close behind. An Anchorage air traffic controller could see the mysterious objects on his radar alongside the Japanese Boeing 747 and requested other U.S. Airlines flights to confirm the traffic. When the U.S. aircraft and U.S. military verified the object's existence as well, nobody knew what to think. The captain himself described the craft as spaceships and participated in multiple interviews about the incident. The FAA began an investigation into the incident, but shortly into it, the evidence of the sighting was allegedly confiscated by a third party. What were the objects that the Japanese crew members witnessed that day? Visitors from another world? Top secret Russian or American aircraft? It seems we won't find out anytime soon. Number 1. The Disappearance of Frederick Valentich. At number 1 on our list, we have the unexplained disappearance of Frederick Valentich, a civilian Australian pilot who disappeared over the Bass Strait near the southern coast of Australia. On October 21, 1978, Valentich was flying to King Island by himself in a Cessna 182. At 7:06 p.m., Valentich contacted Melbourne Air Traffic Control and claimed that an unidentified object was following him at around 4,500 feet. Air Traffic Control reported back to them that they could see no other air traffic traveling at that level. Valentich proceeded to describe what he was seeing, saying it looked like an object that was illuminated by 4 bright green landing lights and had a shiny metal surface. Allegedly, the object was following him at incredible speeds and flying all around his plane. He believed that whatever it was toying with him. When the aircraft controller continued to ask him to identify exactly what kind of aircraft Valentich was seeing, all he could say was, "It isn't an aircraft." The transmission was then abruptly interrupted by a loud scraping metallic sound, and Valentich was never seen again. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to Frederick Valentich. These were our 6 creepy events that happened while flying. Whether it's paranormal encounters in the sky or other terrifying events, pilots around the globe have some of the most interesting stories you could ever hear. Is there anything we missed in the video you'd like to see in future episodes? Let us know in the comments. Consider giving the video a like and be sure to subscribe to Scare Grid for more unnerving content.